In the previous video, we talked about what the supply curve looks like for a perfectly competitive firm in both the short run and the long run. And what we saw was that it was portions of the marginal cost curve. So in general, you can think about the marginal cost curve as representing the supply curve for a competitive firm, but then it's different portions of the marginal cost curve. In the short run, it goes all the way down to the bottom of the average variable cost curve. In the long run, it only goes down to the bottom of the average total cost curve. And the key there is that in the long run, all costs are variable. Okay? So now what we need to do, so we need to think about what the market supply curve is going to look like. Because remember, it's the intersection of the market supply curve and the market demand curve that's going to determine the price. So each individual firm is just one small part of the market. So we need to think about how the whole market is going to function. So we're going to start with the easy case, and we're going to think about what the market supply curve looks like in the short run in a competitive market. So let's start by thinking about the short run. And keep in mind here, we're after the market supply. So let's just put market supply up here. That's what we're after. The nice thing about the short run is that we know that the number of firms is fixed in the short run. So if you were to ask me how many pizza restaurants will there be in Warrensburg tomorrow, I would be able to tell you because I know that it's going to be the same number there is today. Nobody can throw up a pizza restaurant within 24 hours, and if a pizza restaurant, let's say, is leasing its building, then its lease is not going to run up in the middle or run out in the middle of the month. And so tomorrow there will be the same number of restaurants as there are today. Now, if we start moving out into the future, remember, we don't define the short run and the long run in terms of a set amount of time. We define it in terms of the period of time during which the firm has a fixed cost or a fixed input. So if you were to ask me what's the number of pizza restaurants going to look like in 6 months or a year, well, then it could be different. We could have a new restaurant or two move in, could have one go out. So for now, we're going to think about the short run. Number of firms is fixed. So let's put that number of firms, that's important. Number of firms is fixed. Now that makes our life easy because we know that each individual firm's supply curve is its marginal cost curve. And so if you think back to when we were looking at let's put a supply curve over here. Let's suppose we have two firms. Here's a firm, here's a firm. And then if we were going to think about the market supply curve, what we did is we picked a price, like say P1. We went over and we looked at how much this firm wanted to supply at that price. That gave us a quantity here, and at that same price we looked at how much this firm would want to supply, and then that told us that over here at that same price of P1, the total quantity supplied in the market, if these were the only two firms, is this quantity plus that quantity. It's going to end up being something out here, and so that would give us a point on what would end up being the market supply curve. So we already know that if you know how many firms there are, then the market supply curve is just the horizontal summation of the individual firm's supply curves. So it's easy to get in terms of the short run market supply curve. Let me show you an example where we use a few numbers here. Let's suppose that we had, say, 1,000 identical firms. Remember, we're talking about perfect competition, and there are lots and lots of firms. So we wouldn't just have two firms, we would have lots and lots of firms. And so if I were to ask you to come up with the market supply curve for a competitive market, I'm not going to be asking you to horizontally sum over 1,000 different firms or 500 different firms. Even if you did it for 20, it would be really, really challenging and time-consuming. I guess it wouldn't be that challenging, but it would be time-consuming. If we assume that the firms are identical, then it becomes very easy because we can just draw one of the supply curves and then we know what every other firm's supply curve looks like. So let's make that assumption. Let's suppose we have 1,000 identical firms. Let's write that out here. 1,000 identical firms. Now that's clearly a simplifying assumption. Firms aren't identical out there in the real world, but that's fine. We're going to start simple. If we think about what the supply curve for one of those firms looks like, let's suppose it looks like this. We've got price, quantity. Here's the firm's marginal cost curve, right, which we now know is the firm's supply curve. Let's suppose that at a price of $1, this firm would want to supply a quantity of 100 units. Okay. If the price was $2, let's suppose the firm would want to supply a quantity of 200 units. So, and let's label this marginal cost because we know that that firm's marginal cost curve is its supply curve. Now, if we want to get what the market supply curve looks like, let's draw a picture out here, and you're going to have to bear with me here because the scale of my horizontal axis right here is not the same as the scale of my horizontal axis in this second picture. As a matter of fact, what I'll start doing here in just a little bit is I'll start labeling this one Q to represent the amount that a single firm produces. So I'll call that little q, and then I'll call this one big Q. That helps you kind of remember that the scale here is different than the scale here. So if we think about what's going on here, if we were to do this picture, we would have 1,000 of these things all set up out here. We don't need to do that because we know that if every firm's identical, that means that at a price of $1, every firm's going to be supplying 100 units. There are 1,000 firms, so the total quantity supplied would be 100,000. So if we go out here, this would be a quantity of 100,000. 100 firms, each supplying 1,000 units. We know that if at a price of $2, if each firm is supplying 200 units and there are 1,000 firms, then the total quantity supplied would be 200,000. That gives us another point out here on our market supply curve. And if we were to connect those, we would get the market supply curve. So this is our single firm. Let's make sure we label that. That's our single firm. Right here's our market. So you can see that if we're talking about the short run, then we already know how to get the market supply curve. It's very easy. It's just the horizontal summation of the individual firm supply curves. What we want to do now is we want to think about what the market supply curve looks like in the long run, and that's a more challenging situation because in the long run the number of firms is not fixed. So in the long run we don't know this number, right? It's easy when we know that number, but if we don't know that number, then we don't know how many firms we're going to be summing across. So we have to think about the incentives that each particular firm faces in the market. So let's talk about here the market supply curve in the long run. And the key here is that the difference between the long run and the short run is that there is entry, let's say, or exit in the long run. We would never have a situation where there's entry and exit happening at the same time. We know that if price is above average total cost, that means profit is positive. If profit's positive, firms are going to be entering that market. If price falls below average total cost, profit will be negative. And if profit's negative, firms will start to exit that market. So you're either going to have profit positive and there being entry in the long run, or profit's going to be negative and there's going to be exit in the long run. But these two things would not happen at the same time. So now let's make this as simple as we can. We're going to make an assumption that's kind of similar to this identical firm assumption, but we're going to relax it a little bit. So let's suppose that all firms have access to the same technology and they're going to have access to the same markets for inputs. Now here's what that means. This means that the cost curves for the firms are all going to be identical. If they have access to the same technology and the same markets for inputs, then this means that no firm has a cheaper source of inputs than any of the other firms. Okay, so they're all going to be paying the same prices for inputs. they all have the same technology. That means nobody has a cheaper way of producing the good. Okay? So this means that they're all going to have the exact same cost curve. So this is kind of like assuming that they're identical, but we're not really assuming that they're identical. We're just making sure that they have the same cost curves. Now, let's talk about this entry and exit decision. So the decision of whether or not to enter or exit a market depends on whether or not firms are making profit in the market or whether or not firms are losing money in the market, whether their profit is negative. So if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking around for an opportunity, a market to enter, a business to start, then what you're going to be looking for is you're going to be looking for markets where the firms that are already in the market are making a positive economic profit. You're not going to be looking for situations where the firms are losing money, especially not if you've got access to the same technology in the same market for inputs. You may be thinking to yourself, well, but wait, what if I come up with a better way of producing the good, a more efficient way of producing the good? Well, then you would have better technology than everybody else. And so in that case, you might enter a market where all the firms are maybe losing some money, but you've got a better way of producing it, so maybe you could make money whereas they would lose it. We're assuming that away for right now, okay? In the real world, that kind of stuff does happen, but for right now, we're not going to let it. We're going to start with the simplest situation. So now let's talk about what will happen if first profit is positive. And so I'm going to write out here kind of the order of events, and I want you to think carefully about what's going to happen if we start with a situation where firms are profitable. So if firms in the market, if firms are profitable, then what we're saying here, let's write out what this means. We're saying that this means that economic profit is positive. Profit is greater than zero. And this happens, this is the same thing as saying that price is greater than average total cost. Right? Remember, we talked about what profit looks like. And let's put it up here. Remember that profit looks like this. Profit is equal to price minus average total cost multiplied by Q. Profit's also equal to total revenue minus total cost. These are equivalent statements. We can do a little bit of algebra and turn this into that. We did it earlier. So if price is greater than average total cost, then this term will be positive. We'll multiply it by a quantity, which is obviously positive, and our profit's positive. So we're going to start here. If firms in the market are profitable, then that means in the long run, firms are going to be entering the market. So number of firms is increasing. And I'm just going to put here that entry will be happening. That's our entry condition, right? Enter a market if firms are profitable. Well, if the number of firms is going up, think back to what happens in the market if the number of firms is increasing. Remember that the number of firms is a determinant of the market supply curve. So if the number of firms is going up, this means market supply is increasing. Well, if market supply is increasing, then this means that the market price is going to be falling. If you think about the supply curve and the demand curve and what happens if that supply curve shifts to the right, then that means the price is going to be falling. So price falls. Well, if price is falling, then profit's going to be going down. So if this number is falling, then we know that profit falls. And let's think about when this is going to stop. So as long as profit is positive, firms will be entering the market, market supply is going to be increasing, market price is going to be falling, profit's going to be falling. This will continue as long as profit is positive. So this continues until profit is driven to zero. Continues until profit equals zero. So we know that if profit's positive in the market, then that's going to create a series of events that will drive that profit to zero. If profit's positive, firms will enter the market to get in on that positive profit. They're not entering to drive profit to zero. They don't want that to happen. But the act of entering shifts the market supply curve to the right, it drives price down, and this all continues until profit goes to zero. Let's think about what now happens if profit is negative. So if firms in the market are making losses, if firms are making losses. Well, if firms are making losses, then what we're saying there is that profit is less than zero. Profit is negative. That's what a loss is a negative profit. And of course that happens when price is less than average total cost. So you can see that if price is less than average total cost, then this term is bigger than that term and this whole thing is negative. So our profit will be negative. Quantity is always positive. Okay? Or zero if the firm's choosing not to produce. But quantity is never going to be negative. Negative quantities don't make economic sense. So if this term's negative, then profit's negative. Well, if price is below average total cost, that's our exit condition. That means that the number of firms is going to be decreasing because firms will be exiting the market. So the number of firms is decreasing. If the number of firms is decreasing, then our market supply curve is going to be decreasing, right? If that's a determinant of supply, so market supply decreases. Now, if you think about what effect that has, if the market supply curve is shifting to the left, that's going to be driving price up. So market supply decreases, that causes our price to rise. Market price rises. If the market price is going up, then profit rises. Now remember that profit is negative. So for profit to rise, that means the losses are getting smaller. So I'm going to say here, profit rises, but let's put here in parentheses that the losses get smaller. Losses get smaller. And let's think about how long that's going to continue. Well, as long as profit is negative, firms will continue to exit. As long as price is below average total cost, firms will continue to exit. So this exit will continue until price is driven up enough that profit goes to zero. So let's just say this continues until profit equals zero. Continues until profit equals zero. So now let's think about what we've just come up with here. We've just seen that if firms in the market are profitable, if profits are positive, then in the long run other firms are going to enter the market and that profit is going to get driven to zero. The entry would continue until profit falls to zero. We've also seen that if firms are losing money, if price is less than average total cost, which makes profit negative, then in the long run, firms will be exiting the market. That exit is going to be driving price up. These firms are not exiting to help the other firms that stay in the market. They're exiting because their profit is negative. But when they exit, that causes market supply to decrease, it causes price to rise, and that will continue until profit goes to zero. So what we've just come up with is that in a free market, let's put it over here, and this is an important conclusion, okay? So in a free market, in a competitive market, profit equals zero in the long run. Entry and exit, let's say entry or exit, will drive profit to equal zero in the long run. Well, what this means is that if price is ever greater than average total cost, it will be driven down until it's equal to average total cost. If price is ever less than average total cost, it will be driven back up until price is equal to average total cost. So in the long run, price is equal to average total cost. Okay. What we need to do is clear this off, and then we'll take a look at kind of what that looks like graphically, and it's something that we've actually already seen. Let's kind of summarize what we've just figured out here, and that is we know that if price is ever greater than average total cost, then profit is going to be positive and firms will enter. And as the firms enter that market, that's going to drive price back to equal average total cost, and profit will be driven to zero. If price is ever less than average total cost, we know that that means that profit is negative and firms will be exiting in the long run. So the act of exiting will be driving price up. Profit is starting negative because price is lower than average total cost. And our losses will be getting smaller until they are driven to zero. So we've just figured out that in the long run, profit equals zero. Say in the long run, profit equals zero, which means that price is equal to average total cost. Now let's think graphically about what that means. If we look at our picture here actually let's think about a couple of other things that we know about a competitive firm, and then we'll look at the picture. We know the profit maximizing strategy for a perfectly competitive firm is that they're going to produce where price equals marginal cost. Remember, all firms produce, to maximize profit, produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. For a competitive firm, price and marginal revenue are the same thing. They're equal to each other. And so for a competitive firm, they're going to produce the quantity where price equals marginal cost. What that means is we know that if price equals marginal cost, and in the long run, price is going to end up being equal to average total cost because profit's equal to zero, we know that price will be driven to where it equals average total cost in the long run in a perfectly competitive market. Now let's think about what that means. What that means is that each of the firms is going to be producing at their efficient scale, because this point here, this bottom of the average total cost curve, that is the efficient scale of the firm. So let's draw now the picture that we've got. Let's put our firm picture right here. So we've got the cost curves of the firm. Let's put our marginal cost up here, and let's put our average total cost. We saw earlier that if price is ever up, so let's put this point on there. If price is ever up here, profit's going to be positive. If price is ever down here, profit's going to be negative. Right there's the price that would make profit equal to zero, because if this is the price, then the firm would look where price equals marginal cost, which would happen right there. The firm would produce this quantity. We saw in a previous discussion when we were talking about the cost of production that that quantity is the efficient scale of the firm. So what we see is that entry and exit is going to drive price equal to the minimum average total cost in the long run. It can go up here in the short run, but entry is going to drive it back down. It can go down here in the short run, but exit will drive it back up. So in the long run, price is going to be driven to where it equals the bottom of that average total cost curve. Now let's think about what that means in terms of the market supply curve. So what this means is that in the long run, price is always going to be driven back to this price right there where it's equal to the minimum average total cost for the firm. It doesn't matter if there are a few firms in the market or a lot of firms in the market. If there are a few firms, then the total market quantity would be relatively small. but price would be equal to this price. If there were a lot of firms in the market, then quantity would be relatively large, but price would still be equal to this. So if we're thinking about what the market supply curve looks like, it's going to be horizontal. The long-run market supply curve, given the assumptions we've made in this type of market, in a competitive market, is going to be perfectly elastic. So here's our firm, and right over here's our market, and this is the long-run market supply curve in a perfectly competitive market. Price is going to be driven to equal the minimum average total cost. So now let's step back for a second and let's think about something. Usually what I'll do in my face-to-face classes is I'll ask the class, how many of you would go to work every day to earn a profit equal to zero? Because what I've just told you is that in a competitive market, profit is driven to zero in the long run. And if we think about markets that are perfectly competitive, there aren't a lot of them, but there are a lot of markets that act like they're perfectly competitive. If we think about examples of perfectly competitive markets, commodity markets, corn, soybeans, things like that, we've seen that the gasoline market is very close to a perfectly competitive market. So there are several that are we can describe as perfectly competitive. And what I've just told you is that profit gets driven to zero in those markets in the long run. And most students don't really even stop to think about what that means. So if I were to ask you, would you get up every day and go work a job where your profit is equal to zero? Raise your hand if you would. Very few students in my class will raise their hand. There will be a few that will raise their hand. Some of them won't know why they're raising their hand. They will feel like I'm getting ready to pull the rug out from under you, which I am, right? But most students will keep their hand down, which means if you would keep your hand down, you've forgotten something that I knew you would forget. I told you back in a previous chapter that you would forget this. So let's think about, let me tell you a different type of story, and then we'll understand why more about what this means. Let's suppose I get tired of teaching and I decide to quit my teaching job, and I decide that my new plan in life is I'm going to sit at the end of my driveway and sell lemonade. And so I finish out the semester and then you don't see me anymore. And then let's say maybe a year goes by and you see me out at a store and you say, "Hey, Dr. Azevedo, how are you doing?" And I say, "Hey, I'm doing great." And you say, "Hey, how's that lemonade thing going for you? How are you doing there?" And I say to you, "I'm making zero profit." And then I walk away. What would you think about me? I hope that you would remember that I'm an economist, and when I talk about profit, I'm talking about economic profit. And we talked about what the difference between economic profit and accounting profit. And so I hope you would remember that I am not talking about accounting profit. If accounting profit is equal to zero, then I'm making just enough money to cover my explicit costs. The costs of sugar and water and cups and lemons that I need to make to make my lemonade, but no more. I hope you would remember that I'm an economist, and when an economist says profit is equal to zero, that means I'm making enough revenue to cover all of my explicit costs and all of my implicit costs. And if you think about what my biggest implicit cost is going to be, if I quit this job and sell lemonade, my biggest implicit cost of selling lemonade is the opportunity cost of this job that I'm giving up. It's what I make in this job. So I've just told you, when I told you that my profit is equal to zero, then I'm making enough money selling lemonade at the end of my driveway to compensate me for this job that I've given up. That's a whole different story, right? I can't make enough money selling lemonade at the end of my driveway to earn what I could earn teaching. So when we say that profit is driven to zero in a competitive market, we are not saying that people can't put food on the table. What we're saying is that people are being compensated for the cost, the value of their time. Whatever their next best employment alternative is, they're making that amount. So do not think about this in terms of accounting profit, or it won't make sense. Nobody would get up and work a job every day if their accounting profit is equal to zero. But lots of people get up and work a job where their economic profit is equal to zero because they are being compensated for whatever their time is worth based on their next best alternative. Okay? So it's very important that you understand that. What we want to do now is we want to think about what happens if the market demand curve shifts. We want to think about the effect that that has in the short run and the long run. So let's just start by going back to what happens if we were to do this, say, before we ever studied this perfect competition chapter. If we were just talking about a market, we were talking about market demand and market supply, we would draw a picture like that. Here's our equilibrium price, we'll call it P star. Our equilibrium quantity, we'll call it Q star. Actually, let's call it Q1 and P1. Let's get rid of that there. Let's call that demand curve D1. If we were to think about what happens if demand were to increase, then our demand curve would shift to the right to D2. Our equilibrium would move from point A up here to point B, and we would see that that ends up driving our price up from P1 to P2 and our quantity up from Q1 to Q2. So an increase in demand would drive our price up and it would drive our quantity up, and that's where we stopped in our previous demand and supply chapter, and that's fine. What this is a short run picture. This shows us that in the short run, an increase in demand is going to drive price up and it's going to drive quantity up. What we want to do now that we understand what's going to happen in the long run, and that's this stuff, now we can add to this. We can think about what's going to happen first in the short run. If demand were to increase in the short run, it's going to drive price up. But we now want to think about what's going to happen in the long run. And so we'll clear this off and then we'll draw a picture and we'll see kind of the rest of this story. Let's start by thinking about what long-run equilibrium looks like in a perfectly competitive market. So remember, an equilibrium is a condition of rest. So if we're in equilibrium, that means nothing's going to be happening. Well, we just talked about what happens if profit is positive, then something's going to be happening. If profit's positive, then other firms are going to be entering the market. If profit's negative, something's going to be happening. If profits are negative, then firms will be exiting the market. So an equilibrium is going to be if profit's equal to zero. If profit's equal to zero, there's no incentive to enter and there's no incentive to exit, right? You wouldn't exit because all of your costs are covered. All of your explicit, all of your implicit costs are covered. And if profit's equal to zero, well, nobody's looking to enter that market. So let's take a look at what our long-run equilibrium looks like. I'm going to, let's put our market over here. And then let's put a picture of our firm over here. Because remember, the firm responds to what happens in the market. The firm is part of the market, but the firm is reacting to the price that is created in the market. The firm is a price taker. So we'll call this our market, and this is going to be one of the firms in the market. Now remember, we're assuming that our firms all have the same cost curves. So if I draw you a picture of one of the firms, you know what all the firms look like. So we've got our price. I'm going to label this big Q over here, and I'm going to label this little q over here because the quantity that one firm produces is just a small portion of the total quantity bought and sold in the market. So now let's draw our demand curve. There's our market demand curve. That has to do with all the consumers in the market. We're going to, let's go ahead and put our marginal cost curve up here and our average total cost curve for the firms. Now we know that the entry and exit is going to drive price always to equal the price where the firms will earn zero profit, which happens right here. So the firms will be producing this quantity This will be our price that exists in long-run equilibrium. Now, we've also seen that the long-run market supply curve is horizontal at that price. So there's our price. This is our long-run market supply curve. It's perfectly elastic. We also saw that our short-run market supply curve is upward sloping. And for us to be in a long-run equilibrium, which this is the picture that we're drawing here, we're going to be calling this long-run equilibrium. Our short-run market supply curve needs to intersect right here. So if our short-run market supply curve is right there, let's call that short-run supply. Now we're going to be in a situation where nothing's going to be happening. As long as the demand curve doesn't shift, then our price is going to be this price. The firms are going to react to that price, and at that price they produce this quantity. This is the price where the firms are all going to earn zero profit, so there's not going to be any entry, there's not going to be any exit. Okay, so this is a picture of long-run equilibrium. If you ignore this long-run supply curve in this picture right here, then this is just a plain demand-supply curve. This would just be the horizontal summation of all of the individual marginal cost curves. Okay? Now what we want to do is we want to talk about what happens if demand goes up or if demand goes down. Remember, demand is not under the control of any of the firms. This has to do with the consumers in the market. So let's think about what happens if market demand goes up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this picture again right over here, and then we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff over here. But I want to keep that picture because at the end we're going to kind of compare where we started and where we ended. So let's draw this picture again, and this probably goes without saying. You should be drawing these along with me because this is going to look a little complicated at the end. The story is actually very simple, and the picture is very simple if you understand where you start and where you begin, or where you start and where you end. If all you do is you just sit there and passively watch me do this, then when I ask you questions on a test, it's going to be more challenging. If you'll work through it with me, then it'll be much more easy, I think, much less difficult. So let's draw this picture again. So we've got over here our market. We've got here our firm. I believe that it's easier to start with the firm picture because we need to know where this average total cost curve is in order to figure out the price that the firm is going to earn zero profit at. So go ahead and put your marginal cost curve in here and your average total cost. Once we've got the average total cost curve, we can figure out the point at which, the price at which this firm would earn zero profit, and it's right there. I'm going to call it P1. Now over here in our market picture, we know that the long-run supply curve in the market is going to be horizontal at that price where the firms earn zero profit. So there's P1. We've got our market demand curve, we'll call it D1, it's going to shift. And we've got a short-run supply curve. We'll call it short-run supply curve 1 because it's going to shift. Our market quantity is going to be found by looking at the intersection of the market demand and market supply curve. So that happens right here. We'll call that Q1, big Q1. Here is little q1. Remember that this quantity and that quantity are not the same quantity. This is just one of a lot of firms. Each firm is going to be producing this quantity, and if we add it up across all the firms, we get that quantity. Okay? Now I'm going to call this point, let's start right here. This is going to be my initial equilibrium. I'm going to start at A. And over here in this picture, I'll just call that little a. Okay? So let's put together our story down here. Our story is we're going to start at A and little a. Price is equal to P1. Market quantity is equal to Q1. And each firm, the firm quantity is equal to little q1. That's where we're going to be starting. And notice that each of these firms is going to be earning a profit equal to 0. So we are starting in long-run equilibrium. All firms are earning a profit of 0. Now, let's think about what happens if market demand increases. So let's suppose that one of the determinants of demand changes. Maybe this is a normal good and consumer incomes go up. Okay? Or maybe it's an inferior good and consumer incomes go down. Or maybe the price of some related good changes in such a way that it increases the demand for this good. Let's not worry about which particular determinant it is. Let's just suppose that our market demand shifts to the right, to D2. Now, what we want to do is we want to think about what happens in the short run and then what's going to happen in the long run. So let's start with the short run. So let's say market demand increases. Let's say to D2. We end up in the short run. So let's start here with the short run effect. So in the short run, we get a new equilibrium right up here at point B. So the way you find the short run equilibrium is you look at the intersection of your new demand curve and the short run supply curve. Okay? And so what happens in the short run is exactly what you already know happens from an increase in demand. It drives price up and it drives quantity up. So our equilibrium price in the market is going to rise to P2. So we get an increase in the market price, and we can see that our market quantity increases to Q2. So let's go ahead and put that down here. Our market price rises to P2. Let's say quantity rises to Q2. Now let's think about what happens for our firm. The firms are all price takers. They don't have any control over the price, but we've seen what happens when price rises. We've seen how a firm responds to that. The firm is going to look where price equals marginal cost, so we go over here to our marginal cost curve and we hit it right there. We already know that a firm will respond to an increasing price by increasing the quantity that they produce. So each firm will produce a higher quantity than before. So firm quantity, Q, little q, rises to Q2. Now, the firms all made a zero profit at a price of P1, so when price goes up, their profit is going to go up. Now let's look at what profit is going to be. In this picture, we know how to figure out where profit is. We've got our price, we've got our quantity. We need to know the average total cost of producing that quantity Q2. So if we go up here to the average total cost curve, we hit it right there. There's the average total cost of producing that quantity Q2. If we bring that across here, then the area of that rectangle right here will be the profit that each firm earns. Now notice that profit, that little second line, this line right there, isn't the same as P1, because when the quantity changes, average total cost has to go up. Average total cost is at a minimum at Q1, so if the quantity rises, average total cost has to go up. Okay? So there's the profit that each firm is going to earn. So profit is now positive. So that's what happens in the short run. An increase in demand drives price up. Firms respond to that increasing price by increasing quantity and making a positive profit. Now let's think about what happens in the long run. So let's draw a little line here, and now let's put our long run over here. So in the long run, now we're back to that story we had over here on this side of the board. In the long run, if firms in a market are earning positive profit, other firms will enter. So because profit is positive, other firms enter in the long run. Now we know that if other firms are entering, that's a determinant of supply. The number of firms is going to be increasing. And so what's going to be happening is, as other firms enter, the supply curves are going to start to shift to the right. So the supply curve here, this short-run supply curve, let me use the edge of this paper. The short-run supply curve is going to start to shift to the right. And as it does, it's going to be bringing price down. The more it shifts to the right, the more it brings price down. So Firms enter, market supply increases. Now notice that there's two supply curves. Here I didn't label it, but this one's our long run supply curve, but it's horizontal. And if a horizontal line shifts to the right, it still just looks the same. So we don't need to worry about that one. It's this short run supply curve shifting. So if we think about it shifting, it's not going to just shift that much, because if it shifted just this much, price would still be positive. Or excuse me, profit would still be positive, because price would still be above P1. So that entry would still continue. So the entry is going to continue until the short run supply curve has shifted enough to bring price back down to P1. And that would happen once the supply curve is shifted over to this point right here. So our supply curve, our short run, we'll call that short run supply 2. Our supply curve is going to shift to the right. Let's say it increases to short run supply 2. We get a new long run equilibrium right here at point C. So a new equilibrium at C. Let's label here, we had our short run equilibrium right here at point B. That would correspond to this point over here. I'll call that little b. Okay. Now in the long run, other firms enter. That shifts our supply curves to the right. And as those supply curves shift to the right, it's going to be bringing price down. And as price falls, profit falls. If we look in this picture, as price falls, then our marginal revenue curve for this firm would be shifting down. And if price falls back to P1, then the firm is going to be right back there to point A, producing quantity Q1. So price falls back to, let's say, price back to P1. Let's talk now about our firm quantity. Our firm quantity, Q, is back to little q1. Each firm is right back to point A, producing a quantity of Q1. Let's talk about our market quantity. Here's our new long run equilibrium in the market. Our quantity out here, market quantity's up here at Q3. So market quantity, Q, increases to Q3. And of course, because we're back here at P1, profit for each firm is back to 0. So we're at a new long run equilibrium where each firm is making a profit equal to 0. Now let's think about how is it that if our market quantity is Q3, which is higher than where it started, how is it that each firm can be back to producing Q1? And the answer is that there's entry. There's now more firms in the market. Each firm is making 0 profit, producing Q1. But because there are more firms, the market has expanded. Quantity is out here at Q3. Okay. So let's just briefly run through what happened here. We started at a price of P1. All firms were making 0 profit, producing Q1, little q1. In the short run, we had an increase in market demand. And in the short run, that drove our price up to P1, or excuse me, to P2, drove our price up to here. Firms responded to that higher price by increasing the quantity they produced. They ended up moving up here to point B and making a positive profit. That's the short run impact. In the long run, because profit's positive, other firms start to enter the market. And as they enter, the supply curves shift to the right. And that's bringing our price back down. So as this entry is taking place, our price is falling back down to P1. And as price falls back down to P1, these firms decrease their quantity back to Q1. And because price P1 was the price where they earned 0 profit, they're back to earning 0 profit. But now there are more firms in the market. each of which is earning a zero profit. So these firms enter not because they want to drive profit to zero. That's the last thing they want to do. They want to get in on the profit, but the act of entering drives it back down to zero. So we're back in a new long-run equilibrium, and all firms are earning zero profit. What we want to do now, and this probably looks very complicated. This, when you just look at the picture and you look at the story, it appears to be complicated, but the story is actually very straightforward and it's relatively simple. What we want to do now is think about what would happen if we had a decrease in demand. So this is an increase in demand, causes profit to be positive in the short run, but profit gets driven back to zero in the long run. We'll clear this off and then we'll talk about a decrease in demand. We'll see that profit becomes negative in the short run, but is driven back to zero in the long run. So we'll do that here after we clear this off. All right, let's do a decrease in demand now. And let's do the same thing. We're going to start with a picture of long-run equilibrium. So we've got our market here. We've got our firm here. Let's start with marginal cost and average total cost. When you're drawing the picture, it's always best to start by drawing your cost curves because you need to know where this point is. So right here is the price at which the firms are going to earn a zero profit. And that's where our long-run market supply curve is going to be horizontal. So here's our long-run supply curve, horizontal at the price at which firms earn zero profit. So now over in this picture, we can put our market demand curve, call that D1. We're going to shift it. Let's put our short-run supply curve, comes right up through here. That's also going to shift. Our initial equilibrium in the market, we're calling point A. Our initial equilibrium for our firm, we're calling little a. And so right here's the total market quantity, Q1, and here's the quantity each firm is producing, little q1. It should be a 1. Each firm is earning a zero profit, and remember that this quantity is not the same as that quantity. Our scales are different on our horizontal axis. So let's put our story up here. We're going to start at A. Price is equal to P1. Market quantity is equal to Q1. Firm quantity is equal to little q1. Each of the firms is producing little q1 because remember, each firm has the same cost curves. All of our firms have the same cost curves. So all we need is one picture. And each of those firms is earning a profit equal to zero. So we're in a long-run equilibrium. Now let's start with a decrease in demand. Suppose market demand decreases. Market demand falls, let's say, to D2. So we get a decrease in market demand to D2. In the short run, that takes us to a new equilibrium right here at point B. Let's put our B right there. So we get a new equilibrium at B. And we know that a decrease in demand is going to result in a decrease in the market price. Our price falls to P2 and the market quantity falls to Q2. All right, so price falls, P falls to P2, quantity falls to Q2. For our firm, because our market prices fall into P2, each of our firms is a price taker, so there's the price P2. If we go over and see where price would equal marginal cost, it happens right there. So each firm responds to that decreasing price by decreasing the quantity that it's going to produce. And now we can identify the loss that the firm's going to earn, or each of the firms are going to earn. They earned zero profit at P1, so if price falls down here to P2, they're going to earn a negative profit. We've got our price and our quantity. We need the average total cost of this quantity. If we go up from that quantity to the average total cost curve, we hit it right there. And notice that that point has to be higher than where we were at point A, because if you move either to the right or the left of point A, average total cost rises because we know that average total cost is U-shaped. So right up here would be the average total cost of producing this quantity Q2, and this rectangular area right there would be the loss that each firm earns, negative profit. So we get a firm equilibrium, let's call that little b. Profit is negative. Profit is less than 0. Let's put here that the firm quantity Q falls to little q2, falls to. So this is our short run. Decrease in demand drives price down, firms lose money. Now let's think about our long run. Because the profit is negative, each firm's earning a negative profit, firms will start to exit in the long run. So because, and this sentence is very important, because profit is less than 0, firms start to exit. As they exit, remember the number of firms is a determinant of market supply. So the supply curves start to shift to the left. And as the market supply curve, as we shift this short run supply curve to the left, we see that price starts to rise, and that supply curve will continue shifting. The exit will continue until the supply curve has shifted enough to bring our price back up to P1, which would happen right here. So we get a decrease in supply, so short run supply shifts left. And it will shift until it has brought our price back up to P1. So we get a decrease in short run supply to short run supply 2. So short run supply shifts left to short run supply curve 2. We get a new long run equilibrium right up here at point C. So we get a new equilibrium, new long run equilibrium at C. Notice that our price is back to P1. Price back to P1. That means, let's think about how each of these firms, as the supply curve shifts to the left and it brings price back up, as price increases, firms are going to be increasing their quantity back up to Q1. So when price goes back to P1, each of the firms is right back to point A, producing quantity Q1. So firm quantity is back to little q1. Each firm is back to earning 0 profit. Profit is back to 0. Now our market quantity is down here at Q3. So let's put quantity falls to Q3. Each firm is back to producing Q1, but the total quantity in the market has fallen to Q3, and the reason is that there are fewer firms in the market because firms have exited the market. So the size of the market shrinks. But we're back to a new long-run equilibrium at point C, where each firm is earning 0 profit. Our firm started at point A, went to point B, and went back to point A. Remember, they're price takers, so they don't have any control over any of this that's happening. Okay? So if demand increases, if market demand increases, in the short run, profit will be positive because it's going to drive price up, but entry will drive that price back down to where the firms are earning 0 profit. If our market demand curve decreases, in the short run, profit's going to turn negative because that market decrease in the market demand curve drives price down. In the long run, though, firms will start to exit, and as they exit, the supply curve shifts to the left and it brings price back up. The exit will continue until profit goes to 0, until price gets back to P1, and we're in a new long-run equilibrium where all of the firms are earning 0 profit again. So you can see here that this, again, this looks relatively complicated, but as long as you think about it just in terms of the story that we looked at earlier, verbally, where firms in the market are making profit, then in the long run other firms are going to enter, and as other firms enter, the number of supply or the number of firms is going up and supply is increasing. As long as you remember that story, you can use that story to build the long run part of this. It's actually very easy, and we already know the short run part. We learned that beginning once you first start learning demand and supply, you learn the short run part of it. What we want to do now is just kind of think about why the long run supply curve might slope upward. So we've got a long run supply curve here that's perfectly elastic, and the reason is entry and exit is always driving price back to P1. But there are some circumstances under which we could have an upward sloping long run supply curve. So let's say, when might long run supply curve slope upward? What we've got here is what we call a constant cost industry. We don't have the picture we did prior to this one was an increase in demand. Let's think about what happens there. What we saw in the example right before this one is that when market demand increases, that drives price up, and firms respond to that higher price by increasing the quantity that they produce. As they increase the quantity that they produce, that means demand for inputs, which comes from firms, demand for inputs is going to be increasing because they're producing more output. Well, an increase in the demand for inputs typically is going to drive the price of those inputs up. We didn't change the price of inputs in this picture. We held the price of inputs constant. If we were to allow the price of inputs to go up, then these cost curves would start to shift up. If the cost of production goes up, then the cost curves are going to move up. And that means that the price at which the firms earn a zero profit is higher than before. Well, if the price at which firms earn zero profit is higher than where it started, then that means your long-run supply curve is going to slope upward. So we could have an increasing cost industry. Increasing cost industry. What that means is that as the industry expands, as market quantity goes up, as market quantity increases, input costs go up. Input costs increase. The result of that is you're going to have a long-run supply curve that is going to be upward sloping, which is more typical of what we think about a supply curve looking like. Okay? So instead of this long-run supply curve being horizontal, it would be upward sloping. It's also the case that you could have some firms with better technology than other firms. Okay, so if we relax the assumption that all firms have the same technology, or if we were to relax the assumption that all firms have access to the same inputs, if some firms have access to cheaper inputs, then those firms will have cost curves that are lower than the other firms. If we relax either of those assumptions, the technology assumption or the assumption that they have face the same input prices, then we can get long-run supply curves that slope upwards. So if some firms have better technology, then that can result in our long-run supply curve being upward sloping. Here's the general conclusion though. The long-run supply curve is always more elastic than the short-run supply curve. So we can have a situation like this, where we have our short-run supply curve and we have our long-run supply curve. But notice that the long-run supply curve can be upward sloping, but it's always going to be more elastic than the short-run supply curve. And if you think back to our last elasticity chapter, we talked about that. both demand and supply tend to be more elastic over longer time horizons. That's what we're seeing right here. In the extreme case, the long-run supply curve can be perfectly elastic. But this is very rare. Typically, most industries are going to be increasing cost industries, where as they expand, that increased demand for inputs drives the price of those inputs up. And so as an industry expands, the price at which the firms earn zero profit is rising, which causes our long-run supply curve to be increasing. So let's finish this chapter by kind of summarizing what we've learned. So let's I'm going to sneak it in right over here. Let's put a little box right here. This is going to be kind of what we've learned in this chapter. So at the most basic level, we learned the theory of the supply curve for a competitive firm. And what we saw is that firms maximize profit by producing the quantity where price equals marginal cost. If you think about what that means that in a perfectly competitive firm or market, you can be assured that the price you're charged is equal to their cost of production. From a consumer's perspective, it doesn't get any better than that. What we're seeing is that these firms, because they have no market power, they're price takers, they have no control over the price, they end up earning a zero economic profit. And so price ends up being driven to equal the average total cost, and not just any average total cost, it ends up being driven to equal the minimum average total cost. Each firm is producing at its efficient scale. So what we've got here is we've got efficiency in terms of consumption. The price that consumers pay is equal to the cost of production. And we have efficiency in terms of production. The firms are producing at their efficient scale. So total surplus is going to be maximized. There's going to be no deadweight loss with a perfectly competitive market. So each firm is charging you a price. As a consumer, they're charging you a price that's equal to their cost of production. What we'll see is that other types of markets where the firms have some control over the price, that's not going to be true. Those types of firms will not produce at their efficient scale. The price that they're going to charge you is going to be higher than their cost of production. In some cases, they're going to be able to earn a positive economic profit. But in a perfectly competitive market, they're going to end up earning zero profit. Let's just put that here. All firms are going to earn zero profit in the long run, at least given the simplifying assumptions that we made, that they have the same technology and the same market for inputs. If you were to relax that and let, like we said, some firms have better technology or cheaper inputs, then you can have a situation where some of the firms will earn a positive profit, but those marginal firms are going to earn a zero profit. And the marginal firm would be the first firm to exit if price fell, okay? Or the last firm to have entered the market before profit went to zero. So, what we're going to start talking about in future videos are going to be markets where firms have some control over the price, where firms have some market power. But this is a good place to start because we're going to compare everything to this situation. So I'll see you in another video.